This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
This is London FinTech Podcast, episode 001, FinTech, the 30,000 feet overview. In these podcasts, I'll be interviewing key players on both the suit and t-shirt, financial and technology sides of the debate. But first, perhaps some overview is in order. I'm Mike Ballerman. I've been involved in tech for 35 years and in the City of London for 30 years. My twin backgrounds in both financial services and tech make me well placed to investigate and share with you what is going on in this exciting new world of financial services innovation, where all you need is an idea and a laptop. Half of my city time was as a merchant banker in the blue-blooded Claremont Benson, and half as an independent/entrepreneur. I've run a global fixed income investment business and been the first head of risk in the city. The world's leading banks, governments and central banks have been my clients. In 1998, I started my own fintech startup before the term had been created. In recent years, I've done project turnaround and business development in the tech and FS spaces. It really is a golden age of innovation in financial services, perhaps even larger than the last wave of innovation, which started around Big Bang time in the 1980s. It is a once-in-a-lifetime epochal shift. Who will be the financial services equivalents of Amazon, Google and Facebook? Whoever they will be, they will have captured a huge territory and will become the new, difficult-to-dislodge incumbents. How will this affect banking and insurance? When I told folks that I was going to do a FinTech podcast, the most common responses were, "What's FinTech and what is a podcast?" Hardly auspicious omens. On the other hand, there are plenty of excited PR folks out there claiming that FinTech firms will be the end of banking as we know it. What is all this about? Where is it all going? The tropical sun was beating down relentlessly. I walked past stalls of piles of exotic-looking and mostly indecipherable fruits. The dynamic locals seemed to have trading in their blood. Women in burqas walked past, pushing prams. The odd white face I saw was as red as the Asian fruits on the stalls. What appeared to be huge spiky durians were piled high. Men were leaving the mosque after midday prayers. Children were admiring the exotically coloured traditional dresses. I recalled many years earlier the definition of well-travelled as having been to more countries than your age. It was too hot to wonder whether I was still ahead. Fragrant smells wafted out of the local restaurants, mingling oil and spice. The local desserts looked very tasty. I rounded the corner and continued through the restaurant quarter until I came to the old Truman Brewery and turned left. This wasn't another country to add to the list. Rather, I was walking from one FinTech appointment at Central Working in Whitechapel to my next appointment near Google Campus. FinTech is like being in a new country. Not just a new country to you that's an old country to its inhabitants, but a really new country, as if some land has emerged out of the sea and plenty of folks have flocked there. In this 30,000 feet overview, I'll address 4 questions. What is FinTech? How big is FinTech? Why is it important? And why are the changes in FinTech happening now? So first, what is FinTech? You, like a FinTech CEO I had lunch with recently who didn't know he was a FinTech, might be forgiven for not having heard the term. Let's just touch on the fin and tech parts of the word FinTech and then talk about FinTech as a whole. What is fin? Fin generally refers to financial services. Quite often in the fintech world, one hears folks slide from financial services into banks, as in, fintech will disrupt banks. But financial services is much wider than banks, covering banking, both commercial and corporate, securities, corporate finance, asset management, hedge funds, personal finance, insurance, life insurance, non-life insurance, marine Lloyds, to name but a few. What is tech? This is a good question, as I've never heard tech defined. Tech is, of course, an abbreviation for technology, although in the fintech case, it really means internet-related technologies. And perhaps more specifically, it tends to refer to startup or early stage, or at least young companies. I've never, for example, heard IBM referred to as a tech firm. Along with tech, it's worth pointing out, for those of you less familiar with the scene, comes a whole ecosystem. Incubators, accelerators, seed capital all now abound in London. According to London and Partners, there are more incubators and accelerators in London than in any other city in the world. In a nutshell, if you're young, savvy, able to present and have a good idea, then you have a good chance of getting funding for your idea. I say young here, not because there's any innate advantage in being young, although the young do not have the financial and lifestyle commitments of their elders, which is a factor, but rather the terms of the seed funding wouldn't attract the more mature. Seed funders typically take around 8% of your equity in return for a very small amount of cash, around 15 to 25,000 euros perhaps. Not many middle-aged folks would give away so much for so little, hence the age profile. Perhaps more importantly, incubators/accelerators/seed funders give you access to mentoring and a good Rolodex of contacts. Tech also comes with its own culture, which is these days bearded, t-shirted, predominantly male, very full of immigrants to London from all around the world, 20-something, hip and Shoreditchy on the whole. Away from the fashion, there is interestingly a much sharper understanding of business and capitalism. A techie refers to someone very familiar with computers et al. However, the tech sector have a very lot of sharp business skills indeed. Probably as they spring up on the necessity to pitch the good idea in the first place. Over my career, this entrepreneurial spirit has rather been lost in the agglomeration of financial services into predominantly vast bureaucracies underpinned by government. Financial services firms now reflect corporatism more than capitalism. Giant corporations where you risk other people's money are very different from a few of you hot desking and betting your own future, your own money. I'll return to the key business insights of this new capitalist generation later. So putting together the fin and tech parts of the world, what is fintech? Personally, I first recall discussing the scene in the autumn of 2013. The oldest reference I've seen to fintech is a chap who said he first used it in a pub conversation about 4 years ago. I'm glad I don't recall all my pub conversations as well. This year one can see the word in mainstream news media such as The Telegraph, The Guardian and The Evening Standard. Nevertheless, as I said at the start, many or most folks aren't familiar with the term, and you will still hear it being used in about 4 ways, 2 historic and 2 current. Historically, to IT folks, the word fintech just meant IT and finance, and that's been around for some time, of course. For the more front officey types, fintech meant derivatives and such things, ways of structuring financial transactions. In the sense in which the word fintech is being used in the mainstream press, which is a focus of the London FinTech Podcast, it is used in corporate terms to describe the relatively new but fast-growing sector of technology firms, especially startups in early stage who are in the financial services space. In technology terms, fintech in this new sense is leveraging new technology, in particular the internet and the cloud, to get round roadblocks of the past. As well as these 4 uses, there's another vibe which gets left out of this kind of prosaic description. In cultural terms, fintech feels like a bunch of pirates busily raiding a stagnating empire with the ultimate potential of becoming the new empire themselves. Regardless of how we parse the word, fintech is hot, hot, hot. It's a gold rush. Skype's number 1 employee, Tarvet Henricus, who I'll return to later, said, "It's a golden opportunity for fintech innovation for the next 3 to 5 years." As fintech is a happening sector, so many things get lumped in that one wouldn't think of as financial services. I recall one self-labelled fintech as a way of paying your rent over the internet. The 3 most written about areas are payments, raising funds, debt and equity, and virtual currency. Less high-profile subsets are asset management, personal finance, capital markets, regulation-driven activity, banking infrastructure, data analytics, and insurance. As this is the first episode, let's touch on why London is such a key place for fintech innovation. It may be the least politically correct way to say it, but London's long history as a centre of a worldwide empire remains the heart of its success. It remains outward-looking, has a large financial services industry, and is perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in the world. According to London and Partners, who I mentioned before, they're the kind of Mayor's London promotion arm, there are more US banks headquartered here than in New York, which is amazing. Last month, London had its very first highly successful Tech Week, with over 200 events, aiming to highlight London's role as the tech capital of Europe. This was front-page news on the London Evening Standard. As Kip Malthouse, the Deputy Mayor for Business, said at an event I attended, the Mayor's aim is to make the tech sector larger than the city in 5 years' time. The tech sector as a whole, including things like medical technology, education technology, and many others. Financial technology, fintech, is just part of this new tech boom. Not just the Mayor, but the government as a whole has been pushing the tech agenda, and perhaps not entirely unsuccessfully at that. One downside of this is, of course, a flood of highly spun statistics. In Tech Week, it was announced that London was the fintech capital of the world. However, on closer examination, by London they actually include Oxford and Cambridge. I wonder whether that's a land grab by Boris Johnson. Also, the definition of tech is very unclear these days. After all companies have to have an interweb strategy, and in this calculation, which said that London is the largest fintech capital in the world, they included Boots the chemist, amongst others. In a recent Google survey, the UK, as a whole, ranked as the second most important tech hub after the US. 1/3 of European revenues in tech as a whole come from the UK. But let's not worry about these statistics. Undoubtedly, one way or another, London is experiencing a boom in tech firms and fintech firms in particular. Undoubtedly, it is one of the world's leading tech places. Having addressed the first question of what is fintech, let's move on to the second question of how big is fintech. Let's throw some statistics around, with the caveat, of course, as I've just said, that in a world of PR and government spin, as well as corporate spin, it can be hard to trust some of them. The most authoritative report is perhaps by Accenture. 32% of global fintech is in Silicon Valley. 13% is in the whole of Europe. However, this grew 50% in the past 5 years. The UK in turn amounts to over half the fintech investment in Europe. With regards to fintech, since 2008, globally, over $9 billion has been invested in over 1,300 deals. Each year, investment has risen from $1 billion and is now running at $3 billion. This is 4 times all other venture capital growth. Another interesting statistic, which was rather surprising to me, is that since 2000, there have been $39 billion startups in the US and 30 in Europe, of which 11 came from the UK and 9 from Russia. Let's drill into fintech in more detail and pick one of the most prominent subsectors, payments. In terms of the number of companies, there are, on Angel's List, which is an American debt and equity raising platform, over 1,000 payment startups listed. That's amazing. So perhaps you might think twice before becoming the 1,001st payment startup. The world's largest online payment system is not actually PayPal, but China's Alipay, owned by Alibaba. In 2013, they handled $150 billion of payments in 3 billion transactions. So they're just masses of flows which are going around the banking sector, even if ultimately money ends up flowing into the banking sector, of course, unless we have digital currencies. Another subject for another time. More locally, in London, Swedish payments firm Klarna is spending $170 million on its UK rollout. So look, I could go on and on, but it's just numbers. I think in terms of message, rather than the data, as I said, it's more important to realise that this is a real happening sector. If Tom Cruise said, "Show me the money," then the city's mantra for centuries has been, "Follow the money." To those of you with that in your DNA, this is more like a dog whistle. It's a clarion call. This is not folks in a bedroom, not out-of-work graduates on laptops in Google Campus, although both of these archetypes do exist. These are businesses raising 8-figure sums. In London, in recent weeks, using the "if it's in the Evening Standard, it must be high-profile" criterion, Nutmeg, a personal financial site, raised $32 million, and TransferWise, $25 million. You can have a real business with that kind of money. Having spoken about the first question, what is fintech, and the second, how big is it, let's move on to the third question. Why is fintech important? Well, I guess the simple answer is because it's there, because it's big, because it's growing, because it can save you money. But a large part of it is because it's fun. Where else can you storm the castle? A more prosaic point is that in a world where employment patterns change rapidly and increasing numbers of folks are on short-term contracts, it's vital to have good market intelligence about trends. If in your career fortune plays rather more of a part than you might have imagined at the age of 18, then so does the importance of riding the trends. A deeper angle to why fintech is important is reflected in Bill Gates' comment that banking is essential, but banks are not. Widening this out to include the whole of financial services, and skating over the generally ignored angle of banks' role in the money supply, we can say that financial services is a type of activity, not a set of institutions. Let's repeat that. Financial services will increasingly be seen as a type of activity, not a set of institutions. This type of activity could very well be done, and is being done, by a different type of institution. Furthermore, financial services is an old-fashioned sector with high barriers to entry and is widely disliked after the crash of 2008, subsequent taxpayers' bailout, and continued hand-in-the-till mode of the privileged few. It is ripe for disruption. Fees are high, service is poor. Not only that, but as Vernon Hill, the founder of the most recent bank in the UK, Metro Bank, said, if he'd known how hard it is to create a new bank, he wouldn't have bothered. So, knocking on the castle gate isn't the way to disrupt. No wonder billions of dollars are flowing into the startups. Let's look at a key word here, disruption. Mark Andreessen, the inventor of the Netscape browser and all-round Silicon Valley guru, once famously said, software is eating the world. Let's look at how the software has eaten the world in other sectors that sat on fat fees or were focused on themselves, not the consumer. It is often said, somewhat but not entirely accurately, that the World Wide Web has acted to disintermediate. That is, to remove the man in the middle, by in essence connecting the buyer and the seller directly. The classic example is travel agents. One can now book hotels or airplanes directly with the seller, so clearly there has been some disintermediation. However, there's also been re-intermediation. I personally generally start holiday planning with Expedia.com. I may have cut out the travel agent, but I haven't cut out the middleman, although the new middleman is charging rather less perhaps. Furthermore, incumbents in the industry also managed to change and adapt. The likes of trail finders and such, having found a niche where speaking to a human being can add value that a website cannot. So the reality of this web disruption is that we see the web can do one of three things. It can completely disintermediate. I can, for example, book holidays directly with a hotel. It can re-intermediate. I can just switch from the travel agent to Expedia. And, as with trail finders, it can force incumbents to change and find a niche where they add value in excessive fees. And I think these points are very appropriate to banking. Some of banking and financial services as a whole will be completely disintermediated. Some of it will be re-intermediated through web companies rather than existing financial services companies. And thirdly, the financial services companies themselves will increasingly have to focus on where they're adding value in excess of what they're charging. Overall, however, the effect is always to lower transaction costs. Simply put, this is as a result of more efficient processing of information flows. So, we've covered what fintech is, how big it is, and why it's important. Let's move on to the fourth question. Why are the changes in fintech happening now? I first used the internet perhaps some 20 plus years ago, and on an everyday basis 16 years ago. Email and websites have not really changed much since the last millennium. So why has it taken so long to start disrupting financial services? This is an interesting question, but one based on a false premise. The internet has been disrupting financial services for quite some time. I opened an online banking account with Intelligent Finance last millennium, and can't recall the last time I queued up at a branch. On the personal finance front, it's been possible to buy your mutual funds online for a long time. So the financial services industry has been disrupted for some long time already. However, most of these disruptions were from inside the industry. So, for example, Intelligent Finance was set up by the Halifax Building Society, or bank, it changed at some point. Now all banks have online banking. Fidelity made their own web portal for buying and trading and valuing their funds. So what is different now? Why are folks talking about fintech? More insight comes if we look at internet or tech bubbles. There was a huge one in the late 90s around Y2K time. More recently, another bubble appears to be happening with companies like WhatsApp, a company of only a few dozen employees, selling for $19 billion. And interestingly, having been through a few decades of bubbles in all kinds of things, one characteristic of a bubble is when folks come up with all sorts of logical sounding reasons why astronomical valuations are quite reasonable. And for sure we're seeing that now. A good example is Uber, the taxi firm. There are perhaps four angles to why the fintech boom is happening now. Financial services industry angle, technical changes in internet computing, business infrastructure changes, and customer irritation. Let's look at the first. The financial services industry has been shooting itself in the foot reputationally. A global bailout, leading only to higher bonuses in the hands of a few, inflamed global opinion, led people to camp in Wall Street and in the city, and led to many folks happy to vote none of the above. If the financial services industry shot itself in one foot by doing this, then it shoots itself in the other foot by offering poor value, complexity, a lack of real brand differentiation behind the advertising, and a lack of transparency in the product offerings. The second angle on why fintech boom is happening now is technical. It's an order of magnitude, if not more, cheaper than to have a startup now than it was 10 years ago. Smartphones in the cloud have led to a massive democratization in the ability to launch an attack on the castle. There are increasing amounts of high-quality free software out there to get you started. The third reason for the boom now is an increasingly friendly business ecosystem. As Kirk Wiley, the founder of OpenGamma, said, "We raised multi-million seed capital based on 3 people and a slide deck." So it's not just the technical ease and the cheapness of servers and the ability to scale, but also the access to capital for mentoring, connections, and social media has given startups the chance to buy audiences and test clients through targeted paid adverts. The fourth point is customer irritation. This is often misunderstood as Joe Public. However, poor Joe has put up with all kinds of bad service, whether it's from banks or mobile phone providers, for a long time. Rather, coming back to the main 3 areas of fintech, payments, fundraising and virtual currencies, change is being driven by the needs of internet-based companies. As Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, put it, "Every time I go to Silicon Valley, they want to eat my lunch." He didn't add, as perhaps he should have done, this is because Silicon Valley has noticed that it is increasingly paying for the financial services sector's lunch. So if they're paying for it, they might as well eat it themselves. In one talk, I heard it said that the average margin in electronic goods can be as low as 5%. 4.5% can be the cost of payments processing via banks. Whether you are a startup or an established interweb firm, you don't want to be throwing away all that money to banks when you know that fine well all money is a few bits in a computer, and that moving bits in a computer from one computer to another is virtually free these days. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first episode. By now you should have a feel for what fintech is, how big it is, why it's important, and why it's happening now. To pull it all together, make it more practical and round up this episode, I would like to take an archetypal example that I always use to give folks a feel for fintech. One reason it's a great example is it may well save you a lot of money. So listen up, boys and girls. TransferWise.com is for me the archetypally wonderful fintech business for so many reasons. It is real fintech royalty. For me, it combines the golden triangle of clever tech, business simplicity, and clarity, and disrupts banks. First, the clever tech. It was founded by Tarvet Henricus, I mentioned earlier, who is a mere 32 years old, and already has under his belt having been Skype's first employee. They have brilliantly recycled Skype's peer-to-peer technology for this purpose. Secondly, the 21st century business model. As I mentioned earlier, this new real capitalist generation has a much greater grasp on business. Just to pick 2 points, simplicity and solving a genuine pain. Simplicity. What does TransferWise do? We help people save money on international bank transfers. Okay, so you've got that. They help people save money on international bank transfers. Very easy to remember, very easy to tell your friends. And you might like to know that they do it 10 times cheaper than the banks. So far, it has done £1 billion of business, saving its customers £45 million in fees. From a lean business development angle, doing one thing and one thing only very well means it can go viral and get exponential growth. The second point about how it's 21st century business is it solves a genuine pain. This genuine pain was that Tarvet moved to London from Estonia. Each month his £750 salary was transferred over, but £50 went in bank transfer fees. And there's a big difference between earning £750 a month and £700 a month. When he met a chum with the opposite monthly transfer, he realised he could match the deals on both sides by setting up local currency cash transfers and entirely bypass the need to go through the slow and expensive SWIFT international payments process, which takes 3 to 4 days anyway. The third reason I really like TransferWise is that when asked why he will beat the banks, Tarvet replies that banks are slow and expensive. As he points out, this process is going to take time. Skype has taken huge chunks out of the telcos business, but the telcos are still there. In the same way, the low-hanging fruit of the financial services sector will be taken away first, but the current institutions will carry on for some time. And I think we will see this process going forward. So the low-hanging fruit is being taken now, and then slightly higher fruit will come later. Okay, so that's the end of the first show. As I say, it's a rather strange show because I'm giving you the overview. In future, we'll talk more to the people at the coalface. I hope you feel more informed and have a clear picture of the lie of the land. In future episodes, we will dive more into the detail and interview some of the key players on the scene. There are some great stories to tell. Did you know that several African countries, Kenya and Nigeria being good examples, are well ahead of us in personal mobile money transfers? So, for example, they're 5 years ahead of Barclays' recently released Pingit app. In the sector, there are some of the most innovative and creative people I have met. This is a notable contrast to the Clone Wars armies who constitute the human resources to be hired and fired by big companies. All of my chums still there increasingly feel they live in a tight corset of what to say and what to do to survive. In the 1980s, merchant banking was full of smart and interesting folks, as were other sectors. One of the partners of Greaves and Grant, the stockbrokers that Kleinwort acquired, for example, in his spare time, in the days when folks weren't chronically overworked, wrote 3 books on the architecture of Eastern Europe, well before the wall came down. In the 90s, many of the smartest asset managers got up and went and set up their own hedge funds. I think I must have lost track of the noughties as to where the sharp sector went. Let me know if you know. But for sure, in the, I don't know what it's called now, in the tens, a lot of them in the tech startup scene. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and tell your friends. Follow us on Twitter, @London FinTech, and come back and listen next time.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. The city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight